Today we're going to talk about culturally sensitive approaches with gender variant students. And the great thing about this presentation is between the time that I submitted my proposal and now, the APA has actually released guidelines for working with transgender and gender variant populations. So there's a caveat in the guidelines. They did not try, they're addressing particularly, they're focused more at adult populations because it's kind of an entirely different ballgame when we're talking about children. But I have included those guidelines in my presentation so we can kind of talk about where the field is headed, what we're looking for in terms of kind of those culturally sensitive approaches. So I just want to start with some underlying assumptions. So the reality is everybody in this room has worked with someone who's questioned or struggling with issues around their gender identity. So we have to think about this in the broad stroke. I have been misgendered twice already today. I've been called sir. So, you just have to realize that this is something that folks are coming in with, whether it be they have something that's more of an androgynous presentation, whether it's something that's what they're looking for, or whether they're just being misgendered because maybe they're transitioning or there's some other thing that's going on. But we need to realize that this is something that you've likely had sitting in your office, and maybe you've been entirely unaware of that. You can't assume somebody's gender by looking at them. I did an initial assessment with a student, a young man, came in, and after his initial assessment, her initial assessment, every time that student came to see me, they would come early, they would go into our gender-neutral bathroom, change their clothes, change their hair, change their appearance, go back out to the waiting room. I would see her, as soon as we were done, back into the bathroom, back into their other clothing that they came in. So, we need to be really careful about the assumptions that we're making. Another problem that a lot of folks have, and I'm guessing that I'm preaching to the choir here, but gender identity and sexual orientation are two completely separate constructs. The general public has a real problem with this. We also have students that have a problem with this, even students that are grappling with these issues because they don't understand. They themselves don't have the education to even maybe understand what's happening to themselves or what they themselves are experiencing. The reality is that these folks also come to counseling for the same reasons that everybody else does. Last year, I worked with a graduate student who happened to be a trans man, and we didn't talk about it at all. I mean, he mentioned it to me in passing, and then one time said, I was really pissed at my mom because I wanted growth hormone because he was very small in stature, and he knew at a younger age that he was a trans man or was going to get there, and wanted his mom to sign off for him to be able to take growth hormones, and she refused. So, that's the only time it came up, and that was like a passing comment. And the other piece that's really important to realize is we don't want to over-pathologize folks. We're talking about a lot of times these folks are coming in because of either minority stress issues or trying to fit into a society that doesn't really understand them, accept them, reflect their experiences, those types of things. So as I said, we're going to talk a little bit about the new guidelines, which are fantastic. I highly recommend you download them and add them to your repertoire. They were newly adopted at the beginning of this month. And the guidelines are divided into 5 sections, so they're fairly comprehensive in that they encompass all of the areas of work that we as psychologists do. It's not just about, psychotherapy. So, and then each guideline is separated into 3 parts, which I find extremely helpful. It's not just a list of guidelines. After each guideline, there's a section that gives the rationale, which is, what is the research? What do we know from a body of literature about, how this guideline is informed? And then, that's the rationale. And then it gives us the application, which I know that I'm usually hungry for these things. How often do we read things and it's all about the research, and you're like, that's great. How do I make that happen in the room? What does that look like? Right? So the application is then another section that's really helpful. So I'm going to go through these guidelines yes, Amanda. I would say that there's overlap, but they are entirely distinct. So she's asking, I'm sorry, I was asked to parrot these for the camera. She's asking if there is overlap between the WPATH guidelines and these APA guidelines. And the answer is there's overlap to a very slight degree, because I feel like WPATH doesn't do a very thorough job of addressing the work that we as psychotherapists do. So this really provides us with a much more comprehensive framework to work from than the WPATH guidelines. In fact, I feel like we're filling in some of the gaps of that. So foundational knowledge and awareness. I'm also going to talk about the American... I'm sorry, I'm forgetting. It's an acronym. Counseling Center. It might even be, yeah. Anyway, we'll get to it. No, it's not ACTA. It's something else. Anyway, we'll get to it when I get to those slides. I'm just blanking on it. There are some recommended competencies, and there is overlap between those published competencies and these guidelines. So I'm going to go through some of those as well. After we go through these guidelines. So this first set of guidelines is really, this is like the bare bones information that we need to know about the individuals that are part of this population. If we think about our own competency benchmarks that are a lot of our training programs utilize for assessing trainees. Hopefully we're looking at those for our own practice. But these are those foundational information that we all should have. So the big one is that gender is not a binary construct. So it's non-binary. I can tell you anecdotally that this is a tremendous amount of the work that I've done with a lot of the students that I'm working with who are questioning their gender orientation. Because in their mind, they're trying to fit into the binary, and they don't. They don't fit into that. So we also then need to be prepared to provide psychoeducation on gender and how gender exists as a spectrum, and that they could perhaps exist anywhere along that spectrum. So sometimes then the work becomes helping them become comfortable with a gender identity that's fluid, a gender identity that's somewhere in the middle, rather than thinking, well, what society either expects of me is I'm either going to be the gender that matches up with the biological parts I was born with, or I need to transition to the gender that's the complete opposite of that. And so that in and of itself creates a lot of distress amongst folks in this community. The next one is, again, understanding that they're distinct but interrelated constructs. They do become interrelated, and particularly when we start talking about relational issues, that interrelatedness becomes very important. I know a lot of folks because now it's more now, okay? Caitlyn Jenner is all over the place. Orange is the new black, and Laverne Cox, this is all over the place. But again, that's a very narrow view of what a transgender individual looks like. So there is a little more awareness in the general public about this. But a lot of folks come to me and say, wow, I saw this thing on the internet, and I was like, oh my God, that's me. I'd never seen that before. And this is still happening. I just had somebody a couple of months ago come in and say that. Wow, this is brand new to me, and I'd never seen this before, and that just made so much sense, and this is who I am. Because, well, I was saying that I was a lesbian, but I didn't really feel like I was a lesbian. I really think that I'm a heterosexual guy, right? So very important to keep that in mind. We need to understand how gender identity intersects with all of those other elements of identity, and be very cognizant of the ways in which this may be a supportive factor. It's not always a negative. It could provide an avenue for resilience. It could provide an avenue for support or strength. So we need to be broad in our thinking about how these interactions are working on that person and their kind of daily life. We also need to think about our own attitudes about this. Sometimes it's hard for me to understand. And I would consider myself a very knowledgeable ally, but it's still something that for me is challenging at times to understand what that person is feeling, how that person is feeling, because I have no point of reference for that. I have no, memory, experience, anything to grab from in my own personal history to draw upon. Whereas a lot of other clients, I can tap into something that's at least close. I can tap into being a sexual orientation minority, identifying as a lesbian, but it's very, very different, very different. So we need to be very aware of our own biases. I'll put it out there. I'm a little OCD. I'm super uncomfortable addressing someone in the plural, they, their, because it, like, my grammar police crazy person inside, jabs me when I do that. And I've been working with a client that identifies that way, so writing my notes is torture. It's just torture. But I need to be aware of that, because when I'm working with that person, I don't want to be stammering, stuttering, mislabeling. I want to be very careful about that. So I think that that's very important for you to keep in mind. Or you might have somebody in front of you that's appearance is maybe very male, because they're at some point in their transition, but they want to be addressed with female pronouns. And it's like a Stroop test. Green, no, red, so it can be really challenging for us. So you want to be very aware of those things. Okay. So stigma, discrimination, and barriers to care. So this is the second cluster of guidelines. It's an alarming number of particularly trans women of color that are murdered each year. Down in Orange County, we had a very prominent trans activist that was a trans woman that was found brutally murdered behind a dumpster, back of like a 7-Eleven or something. So we need to look at not only those acts of violence in and of themselves, but also then how that impacts the community and how the community feels. Am I safe? Am I going to be safe in this community? Amongst a lot of my colleagues at UCI that work with the LGBTQ population, we talk about UCI as being the bubble. Y'all know that we're in a very conservative county down there. We ain't no Berkeley. Night and day, folks. So we often talk about our campus as like this bubble, right? So students get this safe sense of safety and security that they experience on the campus that they then can't take necessarily out into our local community. Whereas that experience for a student at Berkeley is going to be widely different. You know, if they want to go to San Francisco Pride, it's going to be a very different experience than going to Orange County Pride in Santa Ana, right? You know, we have one. It's itty bitty. But it's a very, very different experience. So we need to be really aware of that and what their environment is like. And, you know, both Amanda and I have had the pleasure of being the shrink on the hill, I call it, the psychologist in residence at our statewide T-Camp, which is a weekend retreat for transgender students and gender variant students across the entire state of California, not just UCs, not Cal States, also private schools, community colleges. And I was up there the first year and we had 60 kids up on the hill, you know, and that was awesome. So, you know, we need to realize that it's hard for these folks to find community and it's hard for them to find places where they're reflected. Yes? Okay, she's asking how would students get connected to that resource. I've been away from it since that first year, but I do believe that it's through the campuses. There's like, you know, unfortunately, I think most of those students have to be connected maybe to their resource center. Amanda? I would contact Nancy Jean. Yeah. So UCR, the folks that started this, it's the brainchild of Nancy Jean, who's the head of the resource center at UCR, and Davidian Bishop, who's the head of the resource center at UCI. The two of them got together. They had both been doing separate efforts, having a day-long thing for trans students, and they put their heads together and said, hey, wouldn't this be awesome? And it was born. So I do know that the UCI website for our resource center usually has advertisements about it, applications that are downloadable. I know historically they've been able to provide some scholarship funding for students to attend. So it's a great resource. We need to, this is really important for us on our campuses. We need to really recognize the institutional barriers that these students face. How would a trans attendee of this conference feel if they needed to use the restroom? There are no gender-neutral restroom facilities available to us. Right? This is another place where I am frequently misgendered. People think that at my ripe old age of 51, I still don't know which potty to go into. I'm working on it. So they come in, they look at me, have a face of alarm, step back out and look at the door. Yep, it's wearing a dress, so I must be in the right one. Right? So, you know, I don't even identify as trans, and I'm having this experience. So imagine what somebody who's identifying as trans is experiencing. But this is much, much broader than restrooms. UCI was the first campus in the UC system to institute with the registrar's office a place for preferred name. We had my first year at UCI, I was fortunate enough to be able to sit on a campus-wide transgender task force. And there was an individual on the task force that worked in the registrar's office, and she worked tirelessly to make this happen. Because think of that poor student. Us queer folk, we're not all super outgoing like I am. Right? There are queer folk that are shy. There are queer folk that have social anxiety disorder. So imagine what it's like. You're 18, 19 years old. You're a transgender individual. And you don't go by Bob anymore. You go by Barbara. And okay, if Bob's going to be read out that first day in class, I'm going to be outed. Or I need to go talk to the professor or initiate a conversation with the professor before I've even started this class around something that is very personal. I have no idea the professor's politics or comfort or anything else about this. And, you know, we talk a lot at UCI about advocate fatigue, right? Those students that, you know, are constantly out there beating down the doors for advocacy on our campus. One of the students that was instrumental in getting our campus-wide task force set up died by suicide 2 years after. It was a horrific loss for our community because this trans man was a tremendous advocate for other students, and other students looked up to this person as a role model. And if that person can't make it, how am I going to make it, right? So we need to be really thoughtful about how can we as allies fight these battles for these students. If you teach, don't make that student be the person in your class that answers all the questions on that topic, right? Don't make that student be the one that's constantly correcting you. Oh, wait, no. You know, I went to graduate school. I got my PsyD at Pepperdine. Undergraduate school is very conservative Christian. Graduate school is not. My trainee is sitting back here, and Jeff is working on his PhD at Fuller, right? So we have places where it's not quite acceptable to be really out. So it's difficult to be that student that's always challenging the professor to use appropriate language, to be more inclusive, those types of things. I'm happy to report my experience at Pepperdine was wonderful because the graduate school is very different than the undergraduate school, but it's not that way for everyone. So be thoughtful about that. Okay, guideline 7. We need to promote. We need to be on the forefront of promoting that social change. You know, our students they have power in a different way, right? We know that students have a lot of power, but they have power on our campuses in a different way than our directors, than our AVCs, than our vice chancellors. And we really need to be prodding those folks to make our campuses more inclusive spaces for this population. Okay, I'm going to just go over this quickly. You know, lifespan development, we need to think about this. You know, I know plenty of folks that are coming out as transgender in their 50s, you know, later in life. More and more we're having people that are more, I also know people who have what they call gender creative children, right? And so, and I know parents that are like, we're just riding the wave, and you know, where the child settles, I'm going to love them wherever they settle, and I'm just going to be with them. And if today they want to play with trucks and tomorrow they want to play with Barbie and wear pink and purple and green and blue, whatever, you know, the parents don't care. But we need to realize that this is something that really age has no bounds on. This is something that can transpire at any point in time in the lifespan. And I don't mean that somebody wakes up when they're 50 and decides, hey, I think I'm transgender. You know, they've likely been experiencing something and maybe not have had language for it or maybe fought it. So we need to realize that just because your student might be a graduate student, this really could be a presenting issue that they haven't really talked about before. All right, now we're getting into the nitty-gritty. Don't over-pathologize our folks. That's the big one. I was really surprised. I was working with an undergraduate 2 years ago, and I was thinking, it's kind of a new world than when I was younger, and the WPATH guidelines have changed. They don't require a year of therapy and all of these other ridiculous requirements that used to be in place. But there's still a memory of that, and we're still viewed as gatekeepers. We're still viewed as the person that has the power to approve my surgery or not. And who the hell are you to tell me something very personal about me, right? So there's a tremendous power differential there. Now letters are not required for hormone treatment. Some endocrinologists will still require that because of their own comfort level, or they don't want it to be on them, whatever that might be. This next one's a duh. I call this a duh guideline, right? People that have positive experiences have positive outcomes, duh. Right? So absolutely, if you experience your environment as accepting and loving and, I'm okay, you're okay, you're going to have a better outcome. I'm going to talk a little bit later about how this applies to students and student outcomes, because that's very important. What are we about? We're about retention. That's our job, to help students stay in school and graduate. Bottom line, that's why the UC system pays our salaries. We know it's bigger than that, but bottom line, that's why our salaries are paid. Romantic relationships. When do you disclose? When do you not disclose? How do we deal with this? If I disclose, is the person going to bolt? Think about that student that you've had that's had HPV or herpes and they're freaking out, or HIV, and they're freaking out about when do I disclose, when do I not disclose. Multiply that times 1,000, and you have that trans students' concerns. Because while those other things are also stigmatized, they're stigmatized in a very different way. The trans person, say you're a trans woman, when you disclose, you could experience violence. That person could act out violently toward you. You've been lying to me, you misrepresented yourself, right? So there's all of these kinds of fears. And whether they're picking this up from things they read on the internet, friends, TV shows, movies, doesn't matter. It's a real fear that I've seen in quite a few of the students that I've worked with. One student I worked with was gender flexible. So he's still identified as a he, but on some days he preferred to present more femininely and maybe even go out kind of in drag, but dressed more femininely. And some days he preferred to dress more male. And it depended on kind of how he was feeling, where he was at with it on any given day. He'd met a new guy, and he'd met this man in the context of a gay male situation. And he was very afraid because he was starting to hit it off with this guy. When do I tell him? When do I tell him? So we sat down and had a really good conversation about, well, let's back up. What kinds of assumptions are you making about his identity? Because he was making all kinds of assumptions about this other person's identity, which they hadn't even discussed yet. I'm happy to report they had a great conversation and everything was fine. The guy did identify as a gay male, but he was perfectly fine with my client's identity of somewhere in the middle, and that some days it might change. And they actually went out one night when my client was dressed as a woman and very femininely. So, it can be a terrifying thing. And I know, unfortunately, a lot of trans folks that avoid relationships because of this. It's too complicated. It's too hard. I have lots of good friends. That's sad. That's kind of heartbreaking. So, and a lot of trans folks, they're not necessarily interested in just finding people in the trans community. There's this term that they use. It's called stealth, right? So a lot of trans folks can be stealth. So you don't even know that they're a trans person. They've transitioned. I do the LGBT mentoring program at Irvine, and I have 2 trans men that are my mentors. You saw them on the street, you saw them in a men's restroom, you would never even think twice about their gender. Their gender presentation, how they perform gender in the world, is very male. There's no question. How I perform gender in the world is very much in the middle. And sometimes there's a question. Being a person of size makes it, if I were petite, I'd get away with this. But because I'm big, it's like, oh, you must be a man, right? So we need to think about these things. But we need to understand how this impacts relationships. If it's somebody that's absolutely stealth, what's that going to be like for them? It's going to be a big, big shock. Parenting. I have friends right now, trans man and his wife. They have a foster child that they're hoping to adopt. What is that like? It comes in a variety of forms. They may adopt, somebody may have a child. There was even that interesting case of that person in the Pacific Northwest who had transitioned to male, and they found out that his wife was infertile, so kind of stopped taking the hormones and everything and was able to get pregnant. So we need to be thoughtful about that. And again, we need to check our own stuff. Ooh, that's weird, right? Well, it's different, but different isn't bad. Interdisciplinary approach is really important. If you don't have resources in your own student health center, if you don't have, the trans guys that I work with, do you know somebody in the student health center that can do my gynecological exam? Because they still need to have those. And they're terrified. I don't want to just walk in there and schedule that appointment because they're going to take one look at me and go, well, what are you scheduling that for? Right? I've had students say, because my legal name is a female name, they won't prescribe me testosterone. Or the pharmacy refused to fill the prescription. Right? So build a resource. Know endocrinologists, know safe pharmacies, know the safe doctors. I know this can be hard. You kind of have to be a little stealth in finding this stuff out. But try to find out, where are those allies out there that aren't going to have a problem? We're talking about a class of individuals who experience objectification regularly. They're stared at, they're asked inappropriate questions. You would never, ever, ever meet someone and ask them about their genitalia. But a trans person, they get asked those kinds of questions all the time. I'm very involved in South Orange County PFLAG, and there's a speaker bureau that goes out, and timeless visits to places, the folks in the audience want to be asking the trans folks, well, did you have surgery, and what's that like, and do you have a fully functioning penis, or do you have sensation, and it's like, we need to be careful as providers. That's maybe not relevant to the work that we're doing with that person. Do not be voyeuristic. So I know a lot of students who've experienced going to student health for a cold, and then all of a sudden they're getting asked all of these questions about their genitalia. Well, I don't get asked about my genitalia when I go in for a cold, and I would think that that was darn weird if I was, right? So why does that happen? We need to be thoughtful about that and have a good network. Finally, research. I'm not going to go over this. We need to be really careful if we're doing any research in this area about how we represent this population. And we need to realize that a lot of trans folks are very leery. They don't want to be used. They don't want to be your guinea pig. So be really thoughtful about that. All right, I'm going to kind of fly through these because a lot of them overlap. So Association of Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Issues in Counseling. This is that acronym that I was trying to come up with. Okay, so again, figure out the presenting needs. This is a competency as a therapist that you should have. You should be able to do a good enough assessment to figure out What's going on here? Are they coming in because of their gender identity? Are they coming in because they're having mental health concerns that revolve around their gender identity? Are they coming in because it has absolutely nothing to do with their gender identity, right? That's a very important competency. Put it out there. I get it that you may not trust me. I am not in a position. I know that some campuses provide letters for folks. We do not at UCI. I'm not in a position to say yay or nay. So I put it right out there. And I put it right out there that, I know that historically that it might have been difficult for folks to seek help and support through this venue, but I'm just here to help you. I don't have any ulterior motives. I want to do whatever's going to be helpful for you. So I put it right out there. Intimate relationships, again, that's huge, and it's across the lifespan. It's really hard. I've known people who have transitioned as a married person. So they've gone from being in a heterosexual relationship to being in a same-sex relationship, and then, as happens in a lot of relationships, over time, the relationship grows apart and they divorce. Now that person's in a position of, oh my God, I've never done this before. And we have students that are in a committed dating relationship when they transition, and then something happens to that relationship. So now they have absolutely no skills to date as a trans person. So it's very important for us to understand that complexity. There's stigma, there's within group pressure. This blew my mind at that first T camp when people were like, I almost didn't apply because I thought that, I wouldn't be trans enough to be accepted. Or I get looked at funny when I attend trans support groups because people look at me like I don't belong there, right? So there's all kinds of stigma and pressure, not only from the outside, but also from the inside. And this can affect how one develops. If you put something in a little box, put a plant, here, perfect example. You have that beautiful plant in your house, and you never move it to a larger pot. Right? Its root system develops to that small pot. And then you pull it out and it's like this cement block of root. And you're like, uh-oh. Right? Well, this is the same thing. This is what happens to these individuals. They're developing in a system where they're not allowed to kind of do the stretching and the growing and the exploring that maybe they need to do. Or it's done in private. I don't know about you guys, but when I have to keep something a secret that's about me, boy, it makes me feel ashamed. When I was younger and I wasn't out and people didn't know about my relationships, there was just so much shame around that. And then when I was older and I was out and I dated somebody that wasn't out, boy, I was like, I don't feel good about this because she's ashamed of our relationship, right? So we need to think about all of those kinds of things that also impact. Hello, dorms. I had a friend of mine whose child is trans and started college, and took them and moved them into their dorm, trans woman, and the roommate arrived, and the roommate happened to have parents that were first generation Chinese, and they were all in the room at the same time, and my friend's parents were like anxious. Okay, are they, how are they going to respond to the fact that their daughter is roommates with my daughter? And what's that going to be like? So the students themselves have those kinds of anxieties. If I want to go to the gym on campus and work out, what locker room am I going to use? And where am I going to take a shower? And who's my roommate going to be? And all of those kinds of issues. So we need to be really thoughtful about those. They're also making all kinds of decisions around where am I going to live, what internships can I apply for, what jobs can I apply for, what career can I pursue. At that first T camp, I was up with an individual into the wee hours. This is like talking about therapy outside of the box. So here I am sitting in the mountains with this individual, and it's like, I think we started the session at midnight, and it went until about 2. And this person had just found out right before the deadline about the T camp, had never really been that out, and decided, you know what, I'm just going to be brave and I'm going to apply. So it was very brand new to this person. The person was at a very prestigious UC as a graduate student in a very male-dominated field, in like neurobiology or something, I don't know. So just something very male-dominated. And they couldn't stop saying, what's going to happen to my career? Because as a woman, nobody's going to take me seriously. I have a friend who's a trans woman that's a philosophy professor at a university, and we knew each other in graduate school, and she spoke very openly about how before she transitioned, how her work was taken so much more seriously, and she just didn't realize how much male privilege there was, even in a field like philosophy, right? Okay, so humanity, but still. So these are things that we really need to think about. Also, again, could be anything. There's a spectrum here. So the folks that you're working with could be anywhere on that spectrum, and you need to know that there are all kinds of ways that someone can live consistently with their gender, and our job is not to force them to decide. A lot of times I say straight out to the student, my job is to help you be comfortable with maybe some ambivalence, without putting yourself in a box. Being comfortable with a moving target, with something that's changing. Just quickly, microaggressions. These folks are microaggressed against many, many times on a daily basis. Many, 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 many times. Right? I've already showed you a couple of microaggressions that I've experienced today. And I don't even identify as a part of this community. So, everything that we do is embedded in the binary. From the time that you're very little, everybody's up in arms. Is it Toys R Us that isn't going to gender their toys anymore? Target, thank you. And people are like, but boys' toys are boys' toys and girls' toys are girls' toys, right? And parents do this. Oh, you don't want the pink one, that's for a girl, right? And my partner just had a very interesting conversation with her 4-year-old grandson the other day. They were doing an art project together, and they were making a car wash, and she was using pipe filaments as the things that hang down and wash the cars, and he loves green, so the ones he had chosen were green. And she said, well, I think it'd be good to have different colors, so I think that and he said, well, why don't you pick some? You pick some colors. And so she picked orange, and he said, no, you can't pick orange. You need to pick pink or purple, because pink and purple are girls' colors. He's 4. Pink and purple are girls' colors, right? So we think about how this is engraved from a very, very young age, from the crib. Look at that handsome boy. He's going to be a ladies' killer. What's embedded in that? Heterosexist, gender, cisgender. That's the world we live in. That's the world these folks have daily experiences in. So we need to be careful about understanding that and also not participating in perpetuating that. If you screw up, it's okay. Apologize. Oh, I'm so sorry, I got the wrong pronoun. I'm really sorry. Just apologize. Acknowledge it. Don't try to gloss over. Okay, what are our students looking at? Higher rates of marginalization, discrimination, harassment. Do you think this leads to good academic outcomes? No, right? So they come into us a lot of times with adjustment disorders, depression, PTSD, anxiety, substance abuse, suicidal ideation, self-harm, all kinds of also anticipatory anxiety and things, I'm going to get rejected, I haven't told my parents, they're going to boot me out, I'm going to be homeless, all of these kinds of things. And of course, they're at increased risk for academic problems. Right? So what are the common issues? I don't belong, I don't like myself, there's something wrong with me, my parents are going to kick me out if they find out. I've worked with students, this blows my mind, where they haven't been home in a year, and they've transitioned, and their parents don't know, and they're getting ready to go home. I'm like, oh, I don't know what to tell you. Or, my parents are not so comfortable with this, but, they're working on it. But my grandmother, she's dying, and she doesn't know anything about it, and I want to see her before she dies. So grandmother's dying, and now you're going to show up, and she doesn't know anything about your gender transition, right? And the weight of carrying that. But grandma wants to see me, and I want to say goodbye, right? Relationships, grief and loss. I don't know, when I was a kid, I wanted to have a husband and 2.5 kids and a white picket fence. I was like, oh, wait a minute, I'll have a wife and a white picket fence, and the kids are negotiable. 2.5 dogs. Sorry, no cats. Sorry. I'm not one of those lesbians. Hate crimes, violence. I was working at Cal State Long Beach when a student was at a night class, excused themselves from the class to go use the restroom. They were in the men's restroom at the sink, at the wash basin, heard their name called from behind, so they turned around. This person rushed them, grabbed their shirt, put it over their head, and with a pocket knife carved "it" in their chest. Right? On a college campus in the third most gay city in the state of California. Right? Third most LGBTQ friendly city. So we need to be aware of that. Body image issues. I'm having sexual intimacy problems because I don't want my partner to touch me. I don't want my partner to see me. Stigmatization, discrimination, obviously suicide. Huge concern. Campus issues. Name on rosters. When are we supposed to be done? Now? Yeah, okay. I'm going to send this to y'all, so let me just go over this quickly. Rosters, bathrooms, housing, student health, biased language all over the place, hate crimes, and resources. We can help change those things, folks. We can be advocates for this community on our campuses, and we all have, in that itty-bitty little piece of time that we have when we're not seeing clients, an opportunity to get out there and really advocate for our students. So I'm going to close it up here. There's more in my PowerPoint, but as I said, I'll send that to y'all, and I'd be happy to answer questions on the phone, or you can email me, or whatever. I'm out there, so just find me. Thank y'all.